Okay, today we are going to talk about Neo-Platonism, and Neo is Greek for new. And so in a lot of ways, we could see this as new and improved Platonism, if you can improve on Plato. But what I like about Neoplatonism is it settles some of the earlier questions that I'm not enough of a Plato scholar to be definitive about. And one of those questions has to do with the concept of the good and of God. And if you remember, the Euthyphro dilemma was, are things good because God says they're good, or are things good because there's an external standard of goodness that God is also looking at? Well, with Plotinus in the 3rd century AD, and Palmer gives us the dates 204 through 270 AD, so 3rd century AD. And Plotinus comes up with what's called Neoplatonism. It's not a type of ice cream. It's a continuation of Plato's thought, Neoplatonism. I mean, as a kid, I would hear that word and just wonder, what in the world is that? But now you are going to know after today. So Neoplatonism by Plotinus in the 3rd century. Now he takes care of that question because the good is firmly placed within the mind of God. So God is that eternal, perfect being from which everything else comes, and the good, the true, and the beautiful are coming from the very mind of God. So in a sense, we could almost take all those Platonic forms we had from Plato and put them right square in the mind of God. And then from those forms, there is an outflowing into the world of physical material things. All right. Now, if I had my whiteboard, I would draw for you the great chain of being. And I did find a couple pictures, though, on the internet. So let me pull up my share screen. And I will talk over these, and maybe, hopefully, it will let me use my little mouse cursor. Can you guys see those images? Okay. So on this one on the left, we have this hierarchy. And when I'm drawing this in the classroom on the board, and you can do this either way, you can start with God on the outside of like a circle of concentric rings and move your way down into the middle. And in the very middle, you're going to actually have non-being. Or you can draw it like a ladder or a stair step, kind of like where you start with the most physical material things and you move up to the most spiritual things. And so you can use these charts as a reference. I'm sorry that one on the right is so tiny. It's hard to make out the words, but while you're looking at those charts, you can actually, I'm going to stop screen sharing so you're not distracted, and I can put it back up again in a minute if you want to see it. Here's another one I found on the internet. Can you see this one? Okay. I like this one even better, but it's hard to make out. So here on the top, we have God. This is the Father of lights. He is pure being. And from God, everything else comes. This is where we get the concept of emanation, not creation, where you have a distinction from God and then the creation, but God is like a fire or a fountain, and life and light and being is flowing out of him. And so God is like percolating or like radiating out life and being. And the closer you are to God, the more life and being you have. The further away you move from God, the less life and being you have, until you get to the very bottom, which is non-being. So here up at the top, we have God, the Father of light, pure being, absolute being, eternal, infinite, cannot be created or destroyed. And all those ideal Platonic forms are coming from God. They're not external to God. They are flowing out of God into the world. In the next rung, we have what's called the Demiurge, and he's not really represented here in this chart. So below God, the Father of lights, we would have another rung, and in that rung it's called the Demiurge. And the Demiurge is Greek for craftsman. So this powerful being, even though he is not God, he is the first emanation from God. And he takes the concepts in the mind of God, and it is the Demiurge that makes the physical material world. Fascinating. So this high God, this Father of lights up here, didn't make the world. He is self-existing, self-consisting, and all the totality of reality is in his mind. The first emanation out from him is the Demiurge, and the Demiurge is the one who creates the physical material world. Below the Demiurge, we have the realm of angels or spirits here below God. And then below angels, we get to humankind. Now, humankind is fascinating because we are on the horizon point between the realm of spirit and the realm of matter. And so everything above this line here is spiritual. Everything below this line is physical material. Humans are unique in that we have both a spiritual and a physical aspect to our being, almost like we're straddling this dividing line of the spirit realm and the physical realm. Now, for Plotinus, he did have this dualism between things of the spirit and things of the physical material world, but he didn't say physical material things were evil or bad. He would just say they have less reality than spiritual things. Not that they don't exist or aren't real, but they are less real than the spiritual things which are closer to God. So you still see that Platonic influence of ideas equal reality, or things that are not seen or more real or permanent than the things that do appear. Below human beings who have both a soul, spirit, and a physical body, we have animals. And even in each of these rungs that we're going through, you could have sub-hierarchies within the rungs. So overall, we have God the Father, Father of lights, over all creation, over all emanation, all the way down to nothingness or non-being. The Demiurge is singular, but even in angels, I don't know if you saw Billy Graham's book called Angels, but he goes through a biblical study and talks about all the different types of angels. And it's interesting, if you study them, some angels aren't mentioned as having wings. There's two-winged angels. There's four-winged angels called cherubim. And there's six-winged angels called seraphim. And then there's archangels. And you even see a hierarchy in the angelic host, where you seem to have archangels, seraphim, cherubim, your run-of-the-mill two-winged angels, your no-winged angels, all within that spectrum of angels. You could do the same thing with humans. And later, we'll see how in the 19th century, Darwin and others actually used this great chain of being for the theory of evolution. But being a materialist, he simply got rid of all the rungs that were above man and just used man as the top of the evolutionary ladder all the way down to single-celled organisms. And so he kind of cropped and used this idea that was already in the Western mindset from the 3rd century and simply removed the spiritual aspect of it and kept the physical part where man was the highest order of creation. And then later, when we get into social Darwinism, you'll see even this rung is gradated, where you would have Aryan Nordic people on top, then you would have like Celts, then you would have like Slavs, then you would have like Semitic type people like the Jews and the Arabs, then subcontinent Indians, and then below that you would have the Asiatic races, and depending on which race you're coming from, you might want yours on top. The Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Malaysians, the Polynesians would all be in that rung. And then below that, they would have a rung of like Africans or indigenous peoples. And there would have a hierarchy there. And then eventually you would come to the lowest rung of human, which, sorry, Carlos, they thought would be indigenous or aboriginal people like the Native Americans or Aborigines of Australia. And there was debate whether those were even humans at all or still at the upper end of the animal kingdom. Surprise, surprise, that social Darwinism was made by Western white Europeans of Nordic and Germanic descent, and they just so happen to put themselves on top and everyone else on the bottom. Then when we get to the realm of animals, you could do the same thing. You could have like a lion or a silverback gorilla or whichever you think is the top animal, all the way down to amoebas, right? Or single-celled organisms. Same thing when we come down to the next rung, to plants. We could have like the giant sequoias or bristlecones on top, all the way down to like mold or slime or algae at the bottom. And then we move, oh, sorry, there's the plants. And then we move down into the mineral realm. And you could arrange it from like platinum and diamonds all the way down to dirt and loam. But then we enter this realm of non-being or nothingness. So we go from pure being, which belongs to God. And think of like if you've ever been around a wood-burning stove or a fire. The closer you get to the fire, the more heat and light there is. The further away in the room or campground you move from that source of light and life, the darker, colder, and lifeless it becomes. So that's a way to think of emanation. Instead of God like creating something distinct from himself, all creation is literally emanating or radiating, flowing out from himself. All right, any questions or comments on this? Is called the Great Chain of Being, and it has become such a big part of how we think in the West. I mean, it's just part of our cultural background or baggage.
I have a question.
Yes.
You know how in the Great Chain of Being, you know how it had the top was God and at the bottom was nothingness?
Yes.
I don't know, I may be incorrect, but to me they're kind of the same thing.
Wow, Carlos, you're wowing me. And yes, indeed, they are the same thing. But philosophy isn't going to get there for another 500 years. So you have jumped 500 years in your mind. Well done. And one of my favorite all-time philosophers, John Scotus Erigena, said exactly that, is that the end is the beginning and the beginning is the end. And God is from that which all things come and that to which all things return. And so that great chain of being, instead of being a hierarchy, turns into like a cosmic loop where the bottom becomes the top and the top becomes the bottom.
Right,
almost
right.
like the geometric shape of like a torus.
Yeah.
Where everyone is at the center all the time, no matter where you are.
Yeah. Or how about that donut thing that you showed us in class where it was like,
yes.
it went out like that?
That's the torus shape.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Interesting. Very interesting.
Is it Taurus? Taurus is the bull. Taurus is the geometric shape. Okay. Very good, Carlos. That was impressive. But I don't want to get ahead of myself to the cosmic loops. So right now, though, we have this hierarchy. And Neoplatonism was, think of the time period here. What's happening in Europe at this time, especially in Greece and Rome, or in Italy, is the Roman Empire has dominated. The church is under severe persecution. Okay, this is the time Augustine would have been alive during, he would have been a contemporary of Plotinus, a younger contemporary of Plotinus. I believe Saint Anthony the Great of the Desert would have been living this time. Christianity was an underground religion. It was under persecution. And this was the philosophic challenge to Christianity. It was a way to teach about God and man and our place and order in the universe without adhering to a Judeo-Christian cosmology. So it's following the ancient Greek cosmologies of Plato, and it's giving like an intellectual and moral challenge to Christian theology. Any questions on that? What's so interesting, though, is when we get to medieval philosophy, and St. Augustine in particular, he believed that Plato was like a pre-Christ Christian. Now, he's not saying Plato is a Christian, but he thought Socrates and Plato, their thinking was so profound that it was like the most revelation a human could get outside of special revelation from the Holy Spirit. And that we should take the wisdom of the Greeks, but then kind of like baptize it or sanctify it in the gospel or the truth given through revelation. And so what happens after St. Augustine, we actually get a syncretism between Neoplatonism or Platonism and Christian theology. And that dominates all the way until like the 12th and 13th century in Europe, where we get a hybrid Platonic Christian worldview. Love it. Okay, any questions on that? But at this point, it started in competition with Christianity. And then when Augustine comes in the latter 3rd, early 4th century, he's able to synthesize them together and say, these are not mutually exclusive, but it's different ways of talking about, or the Greeks have provided like a scaffolding in which we can talk about the truth of revelation and the truth of the gospel. All right. Okay, what else do I want to talk about this? Let me give you some examples of how this affects me on a day-to-day. I'm such a Platonist in my head, and I have all these like little hierarchies going on. And like if you invited me over to your house and you offered me some coffee, the first thing I would ask you, and I know it's rude and guests should just be like, yeah, whatever, but I'm kind of a coffee snob. And so I'm going to ask you, what kind of coffee is it? Or I might even simply ask, is it real coffee? And what I mean by that is a very Platonic meaning or Neoplatonic meaning. I want to know, is that coffee up here on the great chain of being? Like something that is organic, mountain grown, hand picked while the women are singing to the coffee plants as they're picking the berry. I mean, that's what I'm talking about, right? And then it's been roasted in a ritualistic way and it's been made with love. But if you want to offer me Folgers instant crystals, that doesn't even count as coffee in my Neoplatonic hierarchy of coffees. This would be down on the bottom rung, maybe slipping down into not being coffee at all. And that's what I mean. But I would use the same thing, and I know this sounds awful, but it's how I evaluate people. It's how I evaluate civilizations. It's how I evaluate trees. It's how I evaluate architecture. I have this like hierarchy in my head of that which is closest to God and light and life and truth, and then that which is further away. And I have that template that I bring to everything that I interact with. It's like this template on my mind. How crazy is that?
So you're kind of comparing instant coffee to nothingness.
I am. Definitely. And I would drink it in a pinch, but let's call it a warm beverage, shall we? Let's not grace it with the distinction of being coffee. But you could do that with dogs, right? You may think a certain breed, or maybe you think the wolf, right? That is the ideal of the canine form. And then the closer you are to wolfness, like maybe a Siberian husky or an Irish wolfhound or something like that, you would say, oh yeah, that's really close to the ideal. But by the time you get down to like toy poodles or chihuahuas or things like that, are we even talking about canines anymore? We are so far removed from that ideal, if the ideal is wolf, that can we even consider these little rodent critters dogs anymore? And we would take something like Christina's dog would be kind of in between the wolf and the chihuahua. It's maybe a little more towards the wolf side than the chihuahua side, but it's like this template we have in our minds.
Yeah. No, I'm with you 100% on that, Fred. When you said that, I was like, whoa, that kind of blew my mind a little bit because that's the way I've been thinking, you know? And it's crazy because, like, I guess you could say when you put that kind of thinking and hierarchy into like society, I kind of go off titles. And it wasn't until like a year ago till I went to this school that I kind of stopped looking at the titles and started looking for like what it is.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Yeah, and to me, I guess it's a love-hate thing because part of me really resents titles and labels and categories. But if I'm honest with myself, I'm constantly evaluating, judging, critiquing, and it's based on this template I have in my mind. And remember, if you're a Platonist or a Neoplatonist, you believe that is part of having that template of the eternal of God within you. Now, if you're a Christian, and this is why you can see it was so easy for Augustine to put the two together, because all you have to do as a Christian is simply say, oh, the scripture tells us we're made in the image and likeness of God. So, of course, we are going to have God's template inside of us. Easy peasy. And now we have a Neoplatonic Christianity for the next 800 years.
But I have a question though, Fred. How do we know like what is good? You know what I mean? I don't know if that makes sense.
How would a Neoplatonist know what is good?
Yes.
Because they have a concept in their mind of what good is.
Oh, okay.
You're born with it. It's innate. It's intuitive knowledge. The same with the true, the same with the beautiful. And remember, for the Greeks, the good, the true, and the beautiful are synonyms. And now Plotinus makes it quite clear that they're not only synonyms of each other, but they are synonyms of God, because they are coming from the very mind of God. Now, this is not the God of the Bible. I want to be clear. I mean, it could be, and Augustine made it the same, but Plotinus was seeing it as opposed to or in opposition to the God of the Jews or the Christians. He was trying to offer a different vision. But as Christianity began to gain in power and influence in the empire, it actually not only took over the physical reins of power, but also the educational and the philosophical reins and incorporated them into the Christian faith. And they dominated both civil and social society for the next, well, it's still being affected, right? Even though you might say Europe's in a post-Christian era, it's still profoundly affected by that way of thinking.
Interesting.
Any other thoughts or comments on Plotinus and the Neoplatonist? Okay, well, let me go ahead because I think we still got quite a bit of time. And I'm going to go ahead and add Gnosticism onto this one. Although I wish I had my red pen and stuff, because I do not want to confuse you between what is Neoplatonism and what is Gnosticism. And maybe after class, I'll post up the video I did before in case you wanted a refresher of what we're talking about today. And you can at least look at my drawings on the whiteboard and see the distinctions I'm making between the Gnostics and the Neoplatonist. But first of all, for Gnosticism, like Hinduism, this was a 19th century, I believe 19th century term or category that was developed by European scholars. There weren't people running around in the 3rd century BC to 3rd century AD calling themselves Gnostics. But it was a term given to them by like modern scholarship looking into the past. Because there were so many different groups that had similar ideas, but they weren't under one umbrella term. Kind of like in Hinduism. There weren't people calling themselves Hindus per se, but you had different groups following different Vedic or Axal Age religious beliefs in India. And when the English came in, they needed a collective umbrella term to describe the Indians of the religions of India, and they called that Hinduism. Same way in looking at these ancient sects of the Near East, Middle East, we have this umbrella term of Gnosticism put over these individual groups. And I would like to talk about some of the individual groups, but let me just do broad strokes for today. We can do more on Thursday if you want to. Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, 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 and gnosis means to know or knowledge. And so a Gnostic is one who knows. Love it, right? And Gnosticism was this idea of people. They were very similar to 20th, 21st century New Agers like we have here in California with the New Age religious movement. And once again, it's an umbrella term, right? You don't have people probably identifying as, oh, I'm a New Ager. It's an umbrella term to talk about people who have like an eclectic religious sensibilities. Like they may love Jesus's Sermon on the Mount, but they also may love Native American prayers or flute music or the drums, right? And they incorporate that into their spirituality. They might like yoga meditation from Hinduism or Buddhist no mind meditation. They might use labyrinth walking from the medieval Christian tradition. And so it's like California cuisine. The Gnostics were taking bits and pieces of different religious and philosophic traditions and hybridizing them into their own hierarchy. But one of the distinguishing factors of Gnosticism is that they were dualistic. And what I mean by dualistic is they believed in the physical material world and in the spiritual world. And these were two distinct realms. Unlike the Neoplatonists, and this would be my first red flag or my warning to let you know you are now talking about Gnostics and not Neoplatonists, is for the Gnostics, spirit equals good and matter is evil. So now we have a value judgment being placed. The Neoplatonists would simply say the spiritual things like angels or that spiritual part of man is closer to God and the physical aspects are farther away, but they're not evil. Gnostics go full blown and say, if it's physical material, it's evil. And if it's spiritual, it's good. All right. So that's the first distinction I want to make. They're eclectic. They're taking bits and pieces. And so what happens is by the time we get to the 1st century and we have Christianity emerging, and we have by the 3rd century, we have Neoplatonism emerging, these Gnostics are taking bits and pieces of Greek pagan philosophy, Christian and Jewish tradition, as well as other pagan mystery religions and cults that are happening in the Mediterranean at that time. There's lots of different Gnostic stories and creation accounts, but I want to share this particular one with you. And if you're reading, if this interests you and you study different Gnostic groups later, like the Valentinians or others, you may say, that's not what they taught, Blackburn. You were just making it all up. No, there's lots of different versions. Okay, I'm just going to share one with you for a sampler. And this one has to do with the idea of, let's see, how do I want to put it? Let me start with, did any of you see the movie Noah with Russell Crowe in it? Okay. Now, a lot of evangelical or conservative Christians got all bent out of shape about it because they're just like, oh, this isn't the Genesis account, and what is all this stuff going on? Well, the author of that, I mean, the writer of that script, I believe he's also the same person that did the movie Pi, the mathematical symbol pi, and he is coming from a Jewish mystical perspective from the Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism mixed, in my opinion, with Neoplatonism and Gnosticism to create a Jewish Gnostic Platonic hybrid as opposed to a Christian one. And in that tradition, when God created the world, in the Kabbalah, this book of Jewish mysticism, and it's probably written about the 7th century AD, but they would have an oral tradition going all the way back to the Tower of Babel. And in this mystical tradition, when the Father of Lights, who we understand as this high God, he is not the one that made the physical material world. The one who made, and he couldn't, right? Because the physical material world, by definition, is evil. And God, the Father of Light, is all good, pure good, and therefore he can't make anything evil. But that first emanation, who isn't quite as pure and holy and noble as that God he emanated from, because he's once removed, right? Which means he's going to be slightly flawed, slightly broken, slightly less than. And this Demiurge took the concepts in the mind of God and made the physical material world. But the physical material world is a world full of evil. God does, however, create Adam and Eve, and he places them in the garden, in the physical material world. And if you remember the movie Noah, there's a flashback to Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall, and they do not have physical human bodies. They are luminous spirit beings chilling in the garden. They are beings of light. When they disobeyed God, who isn't the high God, it's the Demiurge, because the Demiurge didn't want them to understand who they really were or where they came from. Adam and Eve were spirit beings coming from the Father of Lights. The Demiurge wants to deceive them. And so he tells them, oh, I'm sorry. So the serpent in the Genesis account is actually the good guy, because he's telling Adam and Eve, if you eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, your eyes will be open and you will become like gods, and you'll know where you came from. That it wasn't this Demiurge, this harsh spirit that made you, but you came from the Father of Lights. And with this knowledge, you can return back to where you came from. When the Demiurge finds out what Adam and Eve had done, these spirit beings, he curses them. And if you remember what he did to them, the first thing he did was he clothed them with the skins of animals. So we're not talking about like sheep wool or camel skin. We're talking about this. This is the animal skin you were clothed in, your beards, your teeth, your claws, your flesh. And we are spirit beings encased or imprisoned in physical material flesh. Fascinating. And then to distract us, we're kicked out of the garden, and all these laws and regulations are put on us so that we forget that we are children of light, and we think we are physical material beings bound to this evil, corrupt, sinful world. Wild, right? And so let's fast forward to the New Testament. If you are holding these Gnostic beliefs, and what's so fascinating to me, I believe it was the same year the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the Judean wilderness, that the Nag Hammadi Scrolls were found in Egypt. I believe this is 1948. If someone wants to Google that for me, I'd appreciate it. But the Nag, N-A-G, and the new word Hammadi Scrolls. And I think they were found in 1948. And these were Gnostic texts that had been hidden in the Egyptian desert because they had been condemned by the church as heretical writings for obvious reasons, right? And they were rediscovered, I believe, the same year or at least the same decade that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And so yes, thanks, Wayne.
1945.
45, is that right? Your mic's not on, Wayne, but there you go.
Yeah, I forgot that. Yeah, Christina's right.
Okay,
I just
so
looked it up too.
well, check the Dead Sea Scrolls for me, because I think maybe those are 48 is where I'm getting the 48 from. But I just think it's so fascinating that we're finding text that had not seen the light of day for
You're
almost...
close for the Dead Sea Scrolls, 46 to 47 it says.
Okay, so like...
They're not sure the exact year.
Crazy close, right? And I don't know if that's providential or demonic or what is going on that we would have. And you can get all of them today translated into English and you can read them for yourselves. And so, did any of you see the movie Stigmata?
Mm-mm.
I'm not recommending it, but it's really great. It's kind of like The Matrix meets The Exorcist. And the big thing in this movie is supposedly they have found the gospel according to Thomas. And as they're translating this, it's very different from the gospel we're hearing from the church and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's talking about a very Gnostic sort of being and God and how we get back to that Father of lights. Now, there is a Pseudepigrapha Gospel according to Thomas, which is like, pseudepigrapha means false authorship or false writings, but that's a poor translation. It's kind of like if someone today wrote like the Gospel according to Jesus. I think actually John MacArthur has a book called The Gospel According to Jesus, which you could say is presumptuous, or you could say he's doing it as a devotional. Like if Jesus himself wrote a gospel from his perspective, what would that look like? And so that's how I see the pseudepigrapha. No one was trying to deceive anyone, but these were written probably in the 2nd and 3rd centuries after those original apostles would have died. So the Gospel according to Thomas, it's written, I believe, around 250 AD, but it's from the perspective of if Thomas wrote a gospel, this is what he would have shared. And I think it's wonderful. And I believe you can find that in the Catholic Bible, the Gospel according to Thomas. The Gnostic Gospel according to Thomas, however, is very different. And it is this idea, like I've been rolling out to you, that spirit is good, matter is evil. If man is corrupt and fallen, how much greater has woman been debased, right? And so you have all these hierarchies going on. There's one passage in the gospel, the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, that says women must be converted into men before they can be converted into salvation. Now, I don't know if that's metaphorical or what's going on, if you have to reincarnate and come back as a man before you can get off this wheel of pain and suffering, but it is definitely a different gospel and part of why it was condemned by the church. They also discovered a gospel according to Judas Iscariot, from his perspective. And once again, it's not Judas who wrote this, but someone who trying to think, what would Jesus have, not Jesus, Judas had written if he would have written a gospel. But this is a Gnostic gospel. And actually, I think it was National Geographic, if you want to Google it, did a documentary on the Gospel of Judas, and where they have actors acting out some of the passages. And I want to share one with you because it's especially disturbing. And I have a copy in my office if you just have to see it and want to check it out. But in the Gospel according to Judas, surprise, surprise, is the good guy. He's the only person that gets it because he understands that Jesus is trapped in this evil physical Jewish man's body, this spirit that came down from the Father of lights to get past the Demiurge and all these demons to come down and to show human beings our true lineage, that we come from the Father of lights, and Jesus has descended from the Father of lights to quicken our minds, illumine our souls, and lead us back home to where we belong. The other disciples are worshiping the false god, Yahweh, who is the Demiurge. The creator god of the Old Testament is the Gnostic Demiurge, who made the physical material world and brought evil upon us. This is where the early Christological heresies of the church come from, and I believe John addresses them in his letters, where John says, anyone who denies that Christ is come in the flesh is a false prophet and an antichrist. Because what the Gnostics were teaching was Jesus couldn't have come in a physical material body, or it would have tainted and corrupted his immortal spirit. Or another version is Jesus was kind of like a phantasm, like a spirit, but he wasn't flesh and blood. So they're denying the physicality or the humanity of Jesus, saying he is pure God, pure spirit, but denying his humanity. Other heresies would affirm his humanity and deny his divinity. But in this case, the Gnostic heresy, it's affirming Jesus's divinity, but denying his humanity. Or another version is the spirit of the Christ possessed a Jewish male of the first century named Jesus, did his ministry in his body, but before the resurrection, jettisoned back to the Father. And so those are three different Gnostic versions or Christological heresies. And that's just a fancy word for heresy involving the person and nature of Christ. And if I was doing this on the whiteboard, I'd be doing all the Gnostic stuff in red and the Neoplatonic stuff in black. Because the Neoplatonic stuff, even though it's pagan, it's not necessarily heresy. It's simply another worldview or philosophy competing with Christianity. Gnosticism is weaving heresy through Neoplatonic thought, through Christian thought, through Jewish thought. Because it's a different worldview, it's a different religion. And so Judas, in betraying Jesus, is actually helping him get back to the Father of lights. So when Jesus comes into the Last Supper and he sees all the other disciples praying and beating themselves and begging God for mercy and blessing, Jesus starts laughing, but it's not a happy laugh. It's like a malicious laugh, like, oh, you poor ignorant fools. And the other disciples were actually offended. And they're like, why are you mocking us? Why are you laughing? And he says, because you don't even know what God it is you're worshiping. You're worshiping the Demiurge, the God of this world. I am trying to teach you about the Father of lights, the high God, the God beyond this world, beyond understanding. And so
do we know who actually wrote this?
No. Because it's a pseudonym where someone is writing as if they were Judas, but because of the dating, unless
it was after Judas committed suicide.
Right. So.
Oh my gosh.
But with that knowledge, you may want to watch Noah again, especially if you hated it the first time, because I loved it, because it was just Gnosticism everywhere you looked. If you remember the opening scene, Noah and his sons are out mucking around in the dirt, and they're trying to harvest like these little things of light. And the idea there was that when God created the world, he had to separate himself because he's pure light. He had to make a place of darkness within himself in which the creation would take place. But God wanted to interact with the world going on inside of him, but he can't just peek in at us or his glory would flood in and consume us. So God has to make like a transformer, and there's 10 rungs. It's called the 10 Sephirot, or the tree of life. And God literally is toning down his glory through each of these 10 rungs until we get to God's dimmer switch, which is called the Shekinah. Does anyone Is anyone familiar with that term, Shekinah? Did you watch Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark?
I have a friend who named her daughter Shekinah.
That is the glory of God that filled the Ark of the Covenant and that filled the temple. And do you remember what happened if anyone looked upon that?
They die immediately.
Yes.
The
That's
one person in the Old Testament that opened the ark without permission literally died they didn't even get to poke their head outside. They died, fell on the ground as though dead.
very good, Christina. And it was so dangerous, in fact, that the high priest had to wear bells on the end of their garments so people could listen and hear if they were still moving around in there. Because if God struck you dead in front of the ark, no one could go in and retrieve you.
So they had to pull you out by rope. They literally had to tie a rope around you and pull you out.
So the high priest had a rope tied to his ankle with bells on his garments. And if you stopped hearing the jingling, it meant time to pull him out because
He's screwed.
he's done. Now, if you're a Christian, there's one more dimmer switch below Shekinah, and that's Jesus, where it is God in the flesh, and we can behold him. And as we behold Jesus, it's like we're beholding the Father. But a version that isn't going to melt our eyeballs out of our sockets. So super fast. So I would recommend watching that again. And I just love stuff like that. And not because of the heresy, but I think because it's so interesting to see how different the Genesis account would be. Those stone monsters or giants that were helping.
They were
Noah,
angels, fallen angels.
right. They were fallen angels, and their curse, just like our curse, was we didn't get to be luminous spirit beings anymore. Now we're spirit beings encased in dying and decaying flesh. And we have to poop and pee, and we get tired, and we have to sleep, and we're not just these pure, wonderful, luminous beings. The same thing for the rebellious angels. Their punishment was God encased them in material form. So they were no longer free to just be in the ether, but were now bound to the physical material world. And as they got redemption from God, they were released from their cages of stone. Fascinating. But this is Gnosticism, and it is not Christianity. And unfortunately, there's a lot of Christians. There's a lot of people who think they're Christians, but they're actually practicing Gnostics. And part of the giveaway to me is this hierarchy of being, or this hierarchy of spirituality. Because what the Gnostics were offering was, if you join us, if you come into our sect or our community, we will start you as an acolyte down here on these lower rungs. We'll teach you the basics, the secret handshakes, the secret winks, all that to get you in. But then the longer you dedicate and learn and study, you will move up into higher and higher positions until finally we will give you that knowledge, which will allow you to transcend back into where you came from. And you can see how many organizations in the West have been permeated and infiltrated by this thought and process. And I'm not trying to pick on anyone, so this is not a personal attack, but whether you're Roman Catholic, look at the hierarchy in the Roman Catholic Church. Unbelievable. And the rungs and the gradations and standards. One of my famous religious paintings, and I'm going to share this with you. Be back in a minute. I got to look at it. This is from Abbot Johannes Climacus, who was the abbot of St. Catherine's Monastery, which is at the foot of Mount Sinai and is one of the oldest continuously inhabited monasteries in the world. I think it was founded around the 5th century. And he wrote a book called The Ladder. of
People
divine.
wonder if God will appear to that exact spot like he did to the Israelites.
Yeah, it's a good
You know
question.
you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Back when he was like announcing the 10 Commandments and
It's not the one I
to
want.
their
Sorry.
knees.
I hit an ad. I just want the picture. Let me get below these prices. There we go. Is that a big one? Oh, from Wikipedia. Oh, it's tiny. Hopefully it won't blur out too much. That's good. You didn't get the picture. So, in my personal opinion, this is Gnosticism weaseling its way into Christianity. Up here, you have Jesus, and he's got his outstretched arms and he's cheering you on like, you can do it. Just a few more steps. And over here you have angelic host and the saints who have already made it, praying for you. And here are those on earth praying for you. But each of these rungs of the ladder represent a different vice to overcome or a different virtue to achieve. And eventually, this is Abbot Johannes Climacus, which literally means John the Ladder Climber, which I think is really funny and sad in a way, because what happens is you get this idea that through your own effort, your own study, your own wisdom, or perhaps even the graces God has given you, we climb this ladder. But when you get that ladder climbing mentality in philosophy or spirituality, what happens? Well, if I was John Climacus, I'd be looking at that guy and be going, man, how did that guy get higher than me on the ladder? What's he doing that I'm not? And I'd be looking at all these people saying, yeah, follow me, work a little harder, study a little more, beat yourself up a little more often, eat gross food and not delicacies, and you can be high on the ladder like me. And then these people that because of their own sins or their own weaknesses or the temptations of demons or the evil ones are waylaid and displaced on their spiritual climb, I would probably be judging them like, you should have held on tighter, or you should have kept your eye on the prize and not get distracted. And so it
Hey,
brings,
Fred,
yes.
can you share the picture?
Oh, I thought I was. I'm sorry. Thank you for speaking up.
Yeah.
It will be a lot more interesting with me sharing it. Okay. So what I was pointing out is here we have Jesus up here with his outstretched arms. This is Johannes Climacus in the white robe. And then these are the saints trying through self-discipline, self-control, perfectionism, they're trying to get into the arms of Jesus. These are the saints and angels praying for them, and these are the humans on earth praying. And now the evil one has sent his minions, or these could be like besetting sins, vices, habits that pull us off from our mission. And the problem with this way of thinking, of course, is it makes our salvation, or at least sanctification, our living up in perfection in Christ, it makes it about our effort.
Salvation's not about works.
Right, our
It's
dedication.
not the Muslim scale of good and evil.
Exactly. And what I believe is proper theology is Johannes Climacus, if it so be he is in Christ and has the Holy Spirit in him, he is already in the arms of Jesus. He is already as perfected and holy and sanctified as he will ever be. Now, yeah, we still have to get up every morning and live through life, and there's a raging battle going on, but the battle has already been won. We're already signed, sealed, delivered, secured in the arms of Jesus. But Gnosticism is teaching no, it's this through knowledge, through discipline, through asceticism. This is where we get ascetic practices in the church and in other religions. And remember, for the ascetic, the idea was, are you guys good with this image? If you want to find it later, it's called The Ladder of Divine Ascent. And he wrote a book, which we still have today, that you can buy, and he will describe in excruciating detail what each of these, I think he has 30 rungs in his ladder, what each rung is, what you need to do to overcome it or to achieve it. And I think there's value in it, as long as you don't get confused and think that by your effort, by your self-deprivation, you are going to come any closer to godliness or holiness or righteousness. Because even if you achieved all those things through the strength of your will, all it would do is boast your ego, and it would make you self-righteous. Because look at you. Look at what you accomplished. And I believe the gospel is telling us all of us fall short. All of us have fallen off that ladder. And even the highest ladders of human purity and philosophy and religious devotion don't even come close to getting us to God. This has us where we just need one little hop to get into the arms of Jesus, which is nonsense. The highest goodness of man is still below the lowliness of God.
I have a question.
Yes, buddy.
And correct me if I'm wrong, is that somehow or any way connected to, the ideal, Plato's, his ideal way to run a society? Is that any way connected to his ideal idea to that?
Not what Plato was doing, and not what Plotinus, the father of Neoplatonism, was doing. But the Gnostics came in and they kind of hijacked the Neoplatonic hierarchy and incorporated it into their view. But Christianity did the same thing. They came in and hijacked Neoplatonism and used it to discuss Christian theology. Gnostics did the same thing and used it as a vehicle or a template to discuss Gnostic philosophy. All right, well, that was fun. I've got 13 minutes left, so let me tell you a little bit about asceticism and what that has to do with Gnosticism. And so if you believe your physical body is evil, but your spirit or your soul, what's this non-tangible part inside of you, is good, well, it makes perfect sense. You want to do things to strengthen and grow your spirit, and you want things that will subdue and restrain your body or your flesh. So what kind of things would help you expand or have a stronger spirit? While you're thinking about that, and then the follow-up question is, what kind of thing strengthens your flesh or your body? You've probably heard this in chapels or in your church or other places, and I've heard different versions about every person has two dogs living inside of them. The Native American version is like two wolves, and there's a black wolf and a white wolf, and they're in this death struggle to each other. And of course, it's the grandfather telling the story, and the little boy is asking, well, grandfather, which wolf will win? And the grandfather very wisely says, the one you feed. And so that's the question. How do you feed the wolf of the spirit or the wolf of the flesh? What is their food? What do they eat? What makes them stronger and what weakens them? First of all, that is Gnostic heresy that Christians keep rolling out, and I wish they would stop it. But let's say that what they're saying is true. How would you feed your spirit, and how would you starve it, and how would you feed your flesh, and how would you starve your flesh? What do we do? What would we consider spiritual exercises that people do to try to become more spiritual or more godly?
Meditation, yoga,
prayer, fasting, penance, flagellation, beating ourselves up, those sorts of things. And so what the aesthetics would do is they would try to deprive the physical body of pleasure in the hopes of releasing their spirit. So they would wear coarse clothes if they wore any clothing at all. They would eat the simplest of foods. The simplest, they would drink water, not wine or fruit juices or other things. And some of them would go so far as to physically beat or mutilate their bodies. And their hope was the more they could get their body or their physical desires not to have control over them, the more free their spirit would be to reunite with God. And so that's one way to do it. Ways you could help, well, we talked about how you could foster it. Ways you feed the flesh would be wine, women, and song, or wine, men, and song. And you would do things that fed those appetites of food, of carnal desire, of pleasure. And the more we satiate ourselves with those desires, the stronger we make the flesh, and the weaker and more anemic the spirit becomes. So if you watch my other video, at this point I would draw 2 circles on the whiteboard, and I would label one a carnal person and the other a spiritual person. And so I would draw like a half moon shape inside the circle and just leave a little sliver. And for the carnal person, the spirit is so tiny, it has been almost completely squeezed out of the circle because the flesh now is so big and filling all but the little bit. The spiritual man or woman would be someone who has so fed the spirit that it dominates the circle, and all that's left is just a thin little strip of flesh that really has no more power over it. And that was the ideal. And you see how that influenced early Christianity, the monastic movement, taste not, touch not, handle not, all these sorts of thinkings. And it was people thinking if they did those things, they could become more spiritual and holy. But Paul tells us, no, all you're doing is feeding the will and your own ego. And we need to depend on Christ for our righteousness and our sanctification, not trying to do it through these ascetic workouts and practices. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm pulling out of Gnosticism, Neoplatonism for a minute, and this is Fred speaking to you. There is a place for spiritual discipline and self-control in our lives. I'm not saying just throw that out the window. But if it's not being done through the power and influence of the Holy Spirit that you're yielding yourself to, you're going to get in your head, if I do these do's and don't do my don'ts, I'm going to be climbing these rungs of the ladder. But what's going to happen when you mess up, it's just like that ladder. You're going to fall down and go smack, and then the evil one's going to be on your business saying, ew, what a disgusting person you are. And for me as a young man, I would tell the devil, I got it from here, and then I would personally beat myself up. I never physically beat myself up. I would do it psychologically. I would tell myself what a horrible person I was. And oh, if other people knew what was going on in my head, they would run me out of town on a rail. I would be tarred and feathered and have the capital A branded into my flesh, right? But after I would beat myself up enough psychologically, I would try to start climbing that ladder again. And I'd do my do's. I would avoid my don'ts. But sooner or later, I would eventually fall. And it was just this horrible, vicious cycle of striving, failing, beating myself up, striving, failing, beating myself up. And it's just like this cosmic hamster wheel. But thanks be to God, he finally showed me that I am already in Christ. I don't have to do or not do all these things to get to Jesus. But it's because I am already in Jesus that now I do or don't do certain things. So now my life is an outflow of who I am in Christ rather than me trying to do or not do things to achieve him. That is Christianity. The other is Gnostic heresy. Okay. I hope that was clear. And do you guys want me to put the other video up, or is that good? You could see the whiteboard drawings, but otherwise, I pretty much covered it for you. I'll put it up in the discussion board. I forgot to put on. I'm going to end this recording. Do a little business.